Hello, everyone. I'm extremely honored. My name is Aline Boyd. First, I'm extremely honored because today I will be interviewing Dr. Thomas Lanners. Dr. Thomas Lanners is the professor of piano and keyboard area coordinator at Oklahoma State University. Thomas Lanners has appeared as a solo and collaborative pianist throughout the US and abroad, presenting his New York solo debut at Carnegie Hall in 2004. His performances have been broadcast nationally and internationally. So, Dr. Lanners, I feel extremely honored. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
You
so,
are very welcome. Thank you.
thank you. So, I'll go to the first question. I would like to know more about your music background. I know you have studied at Florida State University and also Eastman School of Music, but I would like to know more details, please.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that because, of course, everyone's journey is a little bit different as far as musical training goes. Um, I'll start by saying that I have, as you know, I have two children who are both musicians, and we started them on piano lessons at the age of 4. And they grew up in a musical environment where they were constantly steeped in music, just all day and night. They were hearing music, most of it live music, a lot of practicing and playing, and we took them to performances from the time they were born. My family was a little different in that there aren't any professional musicians in my family. And so I was very fortunate to come to the piano, not because I was in a family like the one that we're raising right now, my wife and I, but one where there was a family friend who happened to give us an upright piano. Had a player piano mechanism in it with it was a rebuilt like 1920s piano, and it had those little paper rolls that you would put in there and they would spin around and then the keys would go up and down. And of course I was fascinated by that. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And so apparently I just started messing around on the piano a little bit, and my parents decided that I, as the fifth of 5 children, that I would be able to have piano lessons, which I very much enjoyed. So I was 8 years old when I started. Some people start earlier, of course, and but 8 isn't so bad. So, and I began to study just with a neighborhood teacher who my parents knew. They probably had gotten a recommendation for that person. Then we moved from, I was born in Chicago, and we moved down to Florida, where most of my family still lives. And again, studied with a teacher who was someone who lived near where we lived, but someone who was very dedicated to trying to nurture my talent and saw that I had a lot of passion for it. And really one of the wonderful things she did is she played a lot of recordings for me of the great pianists of, I don't know, early to mid 20th century even. Maybe some of the pianists that she heard when she was young. And that was really, I didn't know it at the time, but that was a great formative influence for me to be hearing great pianists like Claudio Arrau and of course Rubinstein and Horowitz, and she loved Wilhelm Backhaus and Dinu Lipatti, and of course, I didn't know who these people were until she played the old LPs of them. So these were things that I wasn't hearing in my household, but that I was being exposed to those things. And she also was great because she took me to like my first piano recitals, my first orchestra concerts, where I heard some wonderful pianists. I remember hearing Georges Boulez when I was very young, playing a Liszt concerto. And of course, I didn't know how famous he was, but it was amazing. And then when I got into my university studies, it was a natural thing for me to go to Florida State, actually, which is a very big music school, as you know. But it was natural because I was a Florida resident at that time. And unlike a lot of musicians who go on to make their career in music, I wasn't 100% sure yet when I went to school that that was what I wanted to do with my life. I just didn't know enough about it. And I wasn't really constantly around a bunch of other professional musicians. And so I didn't know what my odds were going to be to really ever make a living in this field. Anyway, it worked out really well. And I found that I had a tremendous passion for music, much bigger than I even knew that I had. My teacher there had studied at Juilliard with Rosina Levine, who, of course, the great Russian master, and taught Van Cliburn and Garrick Olson and so many phenomenal artists. So I felt like for the first time in my life, I had really tapped into some amazing tradition. And actually, my teacher, pre-college, she loved Garrick Olson, who was younger at that time, and he had won the Chopin competition. And so his was probably the first recording of the Chopin nocturnes I'd ever heard. So I was like, wow, this teacher studied with the same teacher as this guy who I've heard on the LPs. And then, so I worked very hard, of course, as one has to. And I was just thrilled to be able to go to the Eastman School for my master's and doctorate. I absolutely loved it there. I studied with Barry Snyder, who now has become, obviously a mentor whenever you have a teacher for 2 degrees, as I did, but also a friend and someone who we've even worked together at festivals and judge competitions together and such. It's really wonderful to live long enough, I guess, to befriend your teachers, and of course then they continue to be your mentors regardless. So yeah, that was a lot of it. And Barry Snyder had studied with Cecile Genhardt at Eastman, who taught there for many, many decades. She was also the teacher of people like John Perry, for instance, who is someone I studied with at the Aspen Music Festival, which was wonderful. Of course, he has so many students with all the different places he teaches. I'm not in the minority for having studied with him, but it was wonderful. And, one other influence I will say is Jerome Lowenthal. I studied with who of course has taught at Juilliard for a very long time, but I studied with him just for one summer at the Music Academy of the West. But it's amazing how much I feel like I learned from him. He is that rare person who actually had studied with the famous American pianist William Capell, who died very young, tragically, in a plane crash. But then he also took some lessons with Artur Rubinstein. He did I think it was a Fulbright in Paris. He studied with Alfred Cortot, and Cortot would teach these master classes and such. So he had really fascinating insights that were very much firsthand for him. And so again, and then just so many other influences. The other thing, so that I don't prattle on too long, I, especially during my education and during my younger years in the profession, when I was first in the profession, I continued to play a lot of chamber music. And I used to collaborate with many, many singers as well as instrumentalists. And what I learned from their teachers, what I learned from really great singers, great vocal teachers, what I learned from incredible string players and all different kinds of instrumentalists, I feel like I incorporate that absolutely every day in my own teaching, and definitely in my own musical thinking and practicing and performing. So that's a very long answer, but it's hard to describe your entire lineage all at once. But I hope that answers your question.
No, yes, it's great. Uh, Now, my other question: how was the experience to perform at Carnegie Hall in 2004?
Oh, it was wonderful, of course. That was a particular treat at the time, because I had just recorded my first sort of commercial CD release on the Centaur label, and it was the complete piano solo works of Leonard Bernstein,
Yes.
who it had been recorded a couple times before that. James Tocco had done a prominent recording of those, and it's been recorded since then. Most recently, I think Andrew Cooperstock, who's a friend of mine, recorded that repertoire a year or two ago. But I've always really loved that music because, well, Bernstein was so brilliant as a pianist, as a conductor, as an educator. Um, those little pieces were the sorts of things he would play for friends in his home. They're very intimate, most of them. And so when I played that recital, it wasn't like an all Bernstein recital or anything, but it was an excuse for me to say, you know, this recital commemorates um, this release of this Bernstein recording. Of course, Bernstein was such a legend in New York, and Carnegie Hall being in New York, that made sense. So on that particular recital, I played his set of variations that he wrote as the commission piece for the Van Cliburn competition called Touches, which is a really, really fine set of variations. A lot of people play that now, and a little longer, a little more substantive work than some of these short little pieces he called anniversaries that make up most of his solo piano repertoire. But it was wonderful. You know, one of the greatest things about that was that a lot of my friends in music who moved to New York after school, after they finished school, I mean, some of them had gone to school in New York and stayed there. A lot of them came out to the concert, in addition to other people from the public, thankfully. But so some of the most fun was afterward. After I played, the next day or two, I stuck around and caught up with a bunch of friends who are also wonderful musicians. So it was the social side of being a musician is one of the great things. So we get to meet other musicians, and to me, the finer musicians always tend to be really wonderful people, and that's one of the real perks of being a musician.
Exactly.
So I'm sure you found the same thing.
Yeah.
You being a wonderful person yourself. So
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm so honored to talk to you today. Um, now, my question is, you were one of the featured guests at the Shanghai Conservatory International Piano Pedagogy Conference in October 2019. How
mhm.
was that experience of going to Asia and talk about piano pedagogy? So I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. I go quite a lot
Mm.
to Asia and more often to China than anywhere else. And that's not that unusual because, of course, there are so many, literally millions of people, tens of millions of people in China who play the piano
Yeah.
and who really love quote unquote classical piano music. Um, so it's kind of an epicenter for people like myself who maybe teach at universities or conservatories and who are recruiting talented, motivated students. And of course, they start there from a very young age. They work very hard. Some of them are astonishing. By the age of 6 or 7, they're playing things that are really tremendously high level. Um, the conference in 2019, though, and it's interesting you should ask this because just this past week, I think yesterday I would have, were it not for COVID-19, I would have spent last week in China at a festival that I was scheduled, a biennial festival I was scheduled to teach at. That's very often what I do when I go there. I'll teach at festivals and have, you know, lectures and performances, whatever. That particular pedagogy conference, though, last October was the first of its kind that I have done there, that I participated in. And the way they do things in China is, at least my exposure over the years, because there are, of course, so many people there. There may be 4 times as many people as the United States, and they have such respect for Western classical music and for piano playing in particular. Um, the recital hall at Shanghai Conservatory was just packed. I think maybe, I don't know how many hundreds of people, but anyway, every seat was packed. And that's just amazing to see that kind of enthusiasm. It's remarkable. And even though I do not speak Mandarin Chinese or any of the dialects, even though I always need an interpreter whenever I'm there, I find them to be just remarkably attentive. And this particular conference was all of the attendees were, I think all, or nearly all, were university faculty members from all around the country, most of them on the younger end, probably in their 30s, I would say, who were just incredibly thirsty for knowledge. So I was there. Scott McBride Smith was there, who Scott travels all over the place doing these things, former president of MTNA, of course. Um, it really was just a wonderful week. And you also get the feeling when you're there, because classical music is so sort of elevated from a almost status perspective there, that they kind of treat people at these conferences or in musical, almost any musical context there, you're almost like a celebrity or something. I mean, it's very different from the United States. I mean, it's not that people aren't respectful in the United States, but somehow in China they just get so excited about all of this. So it's wonderful. You know, the field of pedagogy in China, I think, in the way that we think of it in the United States, as sort of a subset of what it is to be a pianist. So you no doubt in your studies took pedagogy classes, just as I took pedagogy classes as a performance major. But you know, obviously, we have in the United States pedagogy degrees, usually at the graduate level. So people do their master's or their doctorate in pedagogy. Um, that's not really something that's so common in China yet. The two things that I find are starting to really um, gain traction there are pedagogy, piano pedagogy, like piano pedagogy festivals, even starting degrees, as I understand it. And then also collaborative piano is something that, and you know, there are people who might correct me, but in my experience, they don't focus as much on that. So, you know, from a very, very young age, the pianists focus very, very much on being a soloist. But of course, um, chamber music and collaborating with other musicians is so vital to your growth as a complete musician, and they're really starting to catch on to that, which I think is fantastic. So yeah, I felt like there was enthusiasm. And um, I know the chair of the piano program at Shanghai Conservatory is a good friend of mine, Tang Zhu. And Zhu was telling me that they are, I believe they're actually starting a pedagogy degree there, and developing a curriculum for that. So I think that's something that probably will just get bigger and bigger. So I feel almost in a way like I was on the ground level of something that hopefully will continue to take off.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. It's like in Brazil, we don't have so much like pedagogical courses in terms of a graduate level. That's not so common. In Brazil, they focus more on
Uh,
performance.
there are so many pianists that it's maybe not a bad thing to specialize in different areas, truthfully. I mean, even just from a practical standpoint. But if nothing else, I feel teaching makes us better musicians, and definitely collaborating with other musicians makes us better musicians. So for me, it was just like, even during my training, I understood it as all of that lumped in to hopefully make me a more complete musician.
I completely agree. That's awesome. Now, the other question, your latest recording, Ned Rowland, the three piano sonatas was released in 2007. The disc has received much critical praise. How was the experience of recording those three sonatas?
Yeah, great question. Ned Rorem is someone who is better known by singers and by people, especially Americans, because he's an American composer, although he lived in Paris for quite a number of years. Um, so his roots musically are both American, like sort of rooted in Copland and such, but also French. Lots of Ravel, Poulenc, Debussy can be heard in his music. I actually recorded two CDs of Rorem's music. The first one includes his three piano sonatas, and then the second one includes, up to that point in history, which I think was maybe 2010 or something like that, um, basically the rest of his piano music, except for some small pieces he's written since then, because he's still very much alive at 90. He'll be 97, I think, if my math is right. Anyway, so I fell in love with his music as an undergraduate student playing for singers. So there are a few songs of his that almost any singer is going to know, even like a freshman vocal major with with a very small voice, and they're still sort of developing. Probably the most commonly played and sung one is one called Early in the Morning, and beautiful little, relatively simple song. And it probably was the first one I ever played by Rorem. And what I was doing, sometimes necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. After I had recorded that Leonard Bernstein CD, the person who runs the Centaur record label had encouraged me to, since I'd recorded some American music and I had real enthusiasm for that, to try to find some music that wasn't currently available, or at least a collection of music that wasn't available, most of it, at least, but that was very, very much worthwhile, and that was from a composer who was known and who was really well respected. Like Rorem is won a Pulitzer Prize in music, and definitely a household name amongst singers and vocal accompanists. So I did a lot of research, and I ran across Rorem's name, and I thought, well, I've played a good amount of his vocal repertoire. It's really very good, and the piano parts are good, and he's a pianist himself. So I thought, I'll investigate this, and I found more and more piano scores. A lot of the pieces weren't recorded, so I would have to get them through interlibrary loan, or basically whatever I could do to get hold of these scores. And I found them to be just really, really tremendously well written for the piano, and just beautiful music, and in some cases much more complex, certainly, than the simpler vocal settings that I had played when I was younger. So the first of those that I thought I would record were the sonatas, and then that went nicely. So I thought a next logical project would be to record a whole bunch of the rest of his music that weren't these sonatas. The sonatas were all written around like the 1940s to early 1950s, I believe. And so, he had explored a lot of other styles while always still embracing tonality. So I played pieces up through the early 2000s on that second disc. Now, I had mentioned necessity being the mother of invention. One of the few granting agencies to give co-sponsorship money to actually create a recording, because it costs a lot of money, because there's recording engineer, there's editing, there's mastering, there's the label themselves, etc. Is the Aaron Copland Fund for Music Recording. That was actually the money that is given out as a grant was literally given by Aaron Copland himself. He left money in his will as an endowment, because he recognized that very often what happens with composers, and this is the same as when Copland died in 1990, If they are prominent enough and respected enough, they might get one really prominent, high-profile performance of, let's say, a symphony, for instance. And even if it's really well received, and the orchestra loves it, the conductor loves it, the critics, such as they still exist, love it. The problem really is getting more performances. Um, to get a premiere is one thing, but to have lasting value, so that future generations may explore that same repertoire is extremely difficult. Sorry. Um, so he set up this fund specifically for recording music, not just performing it and then it's gone forever, but actually recording it so there's a document. And I think Copeland was really very wise, because it's fascinating for me and kind of gratifying. I can't really trace a direct line, but I can tell you that since I made those recordings, especially of the sonatas, because I think people like to play sonatas, it's a good chunk of music they can put on their degree recital or whatever. I have judged competitions where people have played Rorem sonatas. They probably had no idea I was sitting out there judging them and I had recorded it, or maybe they did. I don't know. In some cases, I've taught master classes with those Rorem sonatas. So, in some tiny little way, I feel like that repertoire, and please do check it out. Anyone listening to this, you can go on YouTube. You can listen to those. It's really very engaging music, but it seems as though they're being played more often now. So if I had anything to do with that, I'm happy for it. I wish I had more time in my professional life to do a lot more of that, to continue digging up worthy composers who wrote great music that is undeservedly forgotten, whether they happen to be American composers or not. It's been mostly American composers, not only because I'm an American pianist, but because there is this funding source in place that I know of, and I have been fortunate enough to have won a couple of grants from them. But anyway, yeah, that's how that came about. But it's something that I have gotten a lot of mileage out of, let's say, because I'll travel somewhere today and meet someone who I've never met in my whole life, and they'll say, "Oh, I love your Rorem sonatas recording." I'm like, "Wow, you actually heard that? That's that's
That's
wonderful."
awesome.
It's gotten some good radio airplay too. I think it's something that's immediately appealing, and yet it's not that it doesn't sell out in any way. It's actually high quality music, but it's also appealing, which
That's
is nice.
yes, it's wonderful. So I have a difficult question. Which music performance was the most special to you?
In my whole life.
Yes.
Oh, that's hard.
Yeah.
Um, hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I probably would have to go with something very small. You might think it's like a concerto performance with orchestra or something like that, and that's wonderful. And solo recitals here and abroad, whatever. But as you know, my wife is also a pianist, and both of my children are musicians, although one of them is now a freshman in college and he's going the pre-med route. But his main instrument is piano. He plays some violin. My older son started on piano also, but he switched. Well, he never really switched. He still plays piano every day. But his main instrument is cello now, and he's about to start his master's degree at Rice University. So we have done on a couple of occasions, sometimes they're like fundraisers, like just local fundraisers even. We've done like family concerts where we'll play in different combinations. So it might be like a piano duet, and then one of us accompanying a cello piece, or cello and violin, or whatever. I mean, that's so much fun, um, and you get the feeling somehow with this genetic connection, or I don't know what, there's almost like a mind reading that goes on to where we don't really need to rehearse very much. Especially I find like I've played, um, I think, yeah, the Shostakovich sonata for cello and piano. Um, I think my son, his name is Benjamin, posted at least the first movement of that on his YouTube channel, and yeah, we almost didn't have to rehearse at all with that. It's very strange sort of automatic collaboration that went on. Um, so I don't know, in a certain sense, and I mean that's sort of a more personal thing, I know, but in a certain sense, that's maybe the most enjoyable collaborations.
That's wonderful. So now I have the last question to you. As you are professor of piano and keyboard area coordinator at Oklahoma State University, how do you feel about passing your legacy to your students? I know you are a wonderful teacher, and I would like to know how do
Thank
you feel about passing your legacy to your students?
you. Well, I think on a day-to-day basis, I probably don't really even think about that. But when I look back over the years that I have taught, and hopefully in future decades, if I'm lucky enough to continue doing this, I'll have a longer path to look back on. Um, I have a batch of some really wonderful students who are doing some things that are really significant in the field. And I've had the opportunity only a couple of times to hear former students of mine give a master class or do some teaching themselves. And it's such an amazing thing to hear people, and they probably didn't even know they were doing it consciously, but hear them kind of echoing the things I said to them that, of course, then I learned from my teachers, who no doubt learned it from their teachers. It really is, it's an amazing thing to hear some of your own musical thoughts kind of coming back to you that way. I have a former student who is actually a wonderful vocal coach, which, as you know, is a pianist position, is a part of the piano field that we can go into, and he's a vocal coach at Oberlin Conservatory. He's been teaching at Oberlin for 5 or 6 years at least, anyway. But I heard him give a master class. Actually, he came back to Oklahoma State as sort of a honored alumnus or something. He was given some sort of alumni honor. And even just to hear him coach singers and pianists, the level of specificity and how well he expressed himself, and the detail with which he worked, definitely I thought to myself, wow, that's not all due to me by any means. A lot of it's coming from him. But as one of his teachers, and a formative one, it was during his undergraduate, yeah, you kind of feel, I mean, from teaching that sometimes at the end of a teaching day, you feel like, I don't know if I made that much difference today. I did my best. The students are working hard, whatever. But I think it's only when you look back over a longer timeline that you can see something like that. We have students, and I know we're not the only school that does it, but in our undergraduate pedagogy class here at Oklahoma State, we have students trace their applied teacher, their piano teacher's lineage back as many generations as they can. And in piano, it's typical that you can trace your lineage back to Beethoven, and not in that many steps either. And usually you do it through Liszt, who studied with Carl Czerny, who studied with Beethoven. So if you can get back to Liszt, you can get back to Beethoven, of course. And I'm fortunate, and again, it's not that rare, Liszt taught so many students in masterclass settings later in his life. Um, and they became some of the greatest pianists and pedagogues of the certainly early, even into the mid 20th century, some of them. And they taught this person who taught that person who taught that person. I think it's a really powerful exercise for students to count back just like, 6 people, let's say, and get back to Franz Liszt, and then count another 2 people and get back to Beethoven, so that then when they open their Henley score of Beethoven, it's not just this museum piece, like this guy lived 12,000 years ago and I have nothing in common with him, right? Um, if you can just kind of connect those dots and say, okay, my teacher studied with that one, that one, that one, and I'm already back to Liszt, um, then I think it also answers some questions students might have, and I know I did when I was a student, like, how does my teacher know from what's on the page, let's say in a Liszt score? How did they, I understand what a staccato is, I understand what a slur is, what forte and piano is, but all that stuff that's not written in the score, everything that's implied by what's written on the score, how did I know that? How did that get passed down? And of course, it's just an oral tradition. And again, maybe when I was 18 years old as a student or something, it seemed like this was all so far in the past. But now I see that it's just like if you played a little game of what we call telephone, where if you whispered something in the ear of a person, if they whispered it in, 5 to 7 more ears, you'd be back to Beethoven. And it might be slightly changed, but hopefully the basic message would still be communicated. So in that way, getting back to your original question, I hope that there will be some sort of legacy there. I think it's one of the great things about the music profession that we do really, I think most of us, we do really honor our heritage. Maybe if I were in a different field, like I were an accountant or an electrician or whatever, it would be different. Maybe there would be some level of apprenticeship that would be similar. But I think we have something really special. Um, and for me, particularly in piano, and for you, of course, in piano, that there are very real legacies that stretch even across centuries,
Exactly.
since our instrument was invented. And I'm not going to say that, 100 years from now, people are going to be talking about me like they do about Liszt or whatever by any means, but just to be part of, that constellation is important to remember. I think it can keep us motivated when times get tough, like now, where everybody's struggling. Just remember that we are really part of something that's much bigger than any of us, and it's something wonderful.
Yeah, so Dr. Lanners, I'm extremely honored because I'm interviewing you and for you accepting my invitation. Thank you so much for giving me your time and talking to me and explaining so many wonderful things about music and piano and your background. I feel extremely honored.
Thank you so much. The honor is completely mine. It is such a pleasure to share any thoughts, and I hope that the things that I've shared might be of some use or some help to anyone else in the field who sees this. This is a wonderful thing that you are doing, Alini, and I am truly honored to be part of what you're doing. Thank you so much.